Good afternoon, everyone. Come on, you can do better than that. Good afternoon, everyone. Chris Lydon is here himself. Jumped out of that radio box and came on over here. This is, as you know, I generally don't introduce the introducers, and I'm not doing that. I'm just telling you, I just want to say how delighted I am to welcome David Bromwich to Harvard. David and I have known each other actually since the 72-73 academic year at Mother Yale. And we were both in a program that had a great deal of panache at the time. I don't know if it's that amount of panache that has survived, but it was called the Scholar of the House program. And David was one of 12. And I heard him give his presentation. It's the first time I ever saw Harold Bloom, actually. I'd forgotten that. And I couldn't, you know, I was dazzled by David's brilliance and dazzled by Harold Bloom's performance. But David was writing about, as he just reminded me, the American Renaissance. And he talked to me before that about Emerson. And I was a history major. I didn't know anything about close reading or practical criticism. And I was just amazed at how you could talk about a text without being confined to its themes, as a good historian, you know, would approach literature. And so a few months later, I found myself at the University of Cambridge, and ostensibly just to get a second BA, which then morphed magically after the exchange of £5 into a master's degree in the Oxford system. And I was deciding among the history of art, philosophy, and English, and I kept thinking about this. I was intrigued again with what only later I would learn was called close reading. And so I said, what the hell, it's only going to be 2 years, I'm going to come back and go to med school or law school anyway. And I took the plunge and started reading, as we say, English, and the rest, here I am. But the person who sparked that interest, that intrigue in me was my classmate, David Bromwich, who, among our generation, if there's a ranking, there's a number one, it would be Bromwich, who's a professor of English at Yale, a Sterling professor, which is like being a university professor. Here it's a great honor, and in my mind, he's Harold Bloom's successor. And I think in Harold Bloom's mind as well. So I just want to welcome an old friend, a dear friend, a classmate, a fellow Yalie. Bless you. to the other school up here in Cambridge. Give it up for David Bromwich, please.
Good afternoon. I'm John Stauffer. It's my great honor to introduce David Bromwich. David Bromwich is among our greatest living essayists. As you all know, his trenchant essays, have always illuminating, have appeared regularly in the New York Review of Books, The Nation, The Guardian, Huffington Post, The American Conservative, and the London Review of Books, on topics ranging from America's wars and their destructive impact on civil liberties, to the virtual classroom, patriotism, exceptionalism, democracy, empire, the moral imagination, Hemingway, Lincoln, Whitman, among other topics. Writers often use superlatives to describe Bromwich, as I just did. Jackson Lears calls him the most penetrating cultural critic in contemporary America. Edward Mendelsohn says he is one of the most incisive writers in America today. And Marjorie Sabin characterizes him as standing out among American critics as one of the most daring and knowledgeable challengers of received opinion and orthodoxies. A Sterling professor of English at Yale, Professor Bromwich is also a scholar of British Romanticism and the author of 7 books and 6 edited volumes, including 2 important books published in 2014, Volume 1 of a 2-volume intellectual biography of Edmund Burke, From the Sublime and Beautiful to American Independence, and Moral Imagination, a collection of essays. His first book, Hazlitt, The Mind of a Critic, from 1983, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. In his next 2 books, Romantic Critical Essays from 1987, and A Choice of Inheritance, Self and Community from Edmund Burke to Robert Frost from 1989, he articulated a broader redefinition of Romanticism. His essays on modern poetry, collected in Skeptical Music from 2001, won the Penn Diamonstein Spielvogel Award for the art of the essay. In his writings, Bromwich frequently connects past and present. Amid the culture wars of the early 1990s, he published Politics by Other Means, a defense of a liberal idea of tradition and its importance for higher education. And his deep immersion in the revolutions of the late 18th century, amid the crises of the early 21st century, led him to write on America's wars today. I am unaware of previous publications by Bromwich on Frederick Douglass, and so I'm eager to hear his talk today, not only for what he says about Douglass and about Du Bois and Ellison over the next few days, but for how these talks might reflect and engage conversations about race in the early 21st century. Moreover, Douglass read and was inspired by one of Bromwich's leading historical subjects, Edmund Burke. For example, in an 1846 letter, Douglass accused the American minister Samuel Cox of compromising his anti-slavery principles by quoting from Burke's 1775 speech on resolutions for conciliation with the colonies, in which Burke told his listeners to pardon something to the spirit of liberty. And in 1851, Douglass included Burke among a brilliant constellation of Irish intellectuals who taught England the folly of oppression. Like these Irish intellectuals, Professor Bromwich is himself a brilliant teacher. At Yale, he teaches the Major English Poets course in the History Politics section of the renowned Directed Studies curriculum, as well as lectures on Romanticism and on rhetoric, along with a wide variety of seminars. A friend of mine who studied with Bromwich at Yale captured something of his magic in the classroom and his devotion as a mentor. I recently mentioned his name in casual conversation, and she gushingly said, "I adore David Bromwich." Please join me in welcoming David Bromwich.
Thank you. Put this thing on. How's this? It's okay? Okay, thank you. And thank you for those more than generous introductions. I only half believe what Skip said about my being the inspiration for his course of study and half his course of life, but we'll take it. And it's very good to be here, not only here at Harvard, but here giving one of this distinguished series of Huggins lectures. The three talks I'll give aim to offer a narrow, concentrated, and to some extent didactic reading of a small subset of the writings of Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, and Ralph Ellison. I chose the examples for their forcefulness and subtlety, and also because they address, in separate contexts and with vastly different rhetorical methods, a general question about the experience of black people and the justice owed to them in American society. Burke said, and I didn't know about Douglass's reading of Burke, so I'm grateful for that reinforcement. Burke said, "It is an arduous thing to plead against abuses of a power which originates from your own country and affects those whom we are used to consider as strangers." But that was a British statesman speaking about British India, asking his countrymen to face their responsibilities to strangers outside. The peculiarity of the situation of Douglas, Du Bois, and Ellison is that they have to speak, let's say, as moral statesmen, for want of a better term, statesmen in the world of public life and letters, to a country that they may feel both is and is not properly their own. They are the domestic voice protesting an abuse that originates from the home country, and at the same time they are the stranger whose cause they plead. Though only half a dozen specimens will be analyzed in the next few days, I treat them as a sort of epitome. The hope is to appreciate the original energy and persuasive power these writers bring to their arduous work. They are, in a way, accusers, but of a particular kind. They have no process but writing or speaking and writing, and the reform they look to, first of all, is a reform of thought. We're dealing with an aspect of the discipline that's forced on political writers, then, where both words are stressed. Political writing. Though with Du Bois it would be fairer to call him partly political, partly scholarly in his characteristic mode of presentation. And in the case of Ellison, a writer who is episodically political, almost against his will. They want not just to expose an injustice and work for its rectification, they also feel compelled to address directly those who commit the injustice as well as those who suffer. Their purpose is never merely to console and lift the spirit of those who suffer, or merely to induce shame and remorse in those who commit the injustice. They speak to both doers and sufferers at once to promote an understanding of the cause of the injustice. The goal, again, is not necessarily to unify, it is to deepen a kind of thought that leads to action. Thought about the past as well as the present. Theirs is then a work of imagination and of judgment. In all three writers, the urgency springs from a noble idealism regarding the possibilities of human life, and especially life in a democracy dedicated to the principles of liberty and equality. Alongside their own idealisms may run a countercurrent of irritation or disgust at the spectacle of the fallibility and weakness of human beings of all races. Du Bois and Ellison are both, in some sense, ironists and accomplished at shading their sentences with secondary and subversive intuitions of this sort. Douglas is in this regard the outlier of the three. As an orator and a close thinker about politics and morality, Douglas is the figure in our period of deepest crisis who stands beside Lincoln as someone of comparable stature. Both lived public lives and indeed sought fame in their quest to achieve an unselfish good. Yet there remains this puzzle about both men. Though Douglas was a copious autobiographer, and regarding Lincoln from the age of 30 or so, there is very little we cannot know. Still, we may sense there is in them an unsearchable residuum. They were men of relentless energy who had and exercised the power to shape the way they were understood, but there is a sense in which neither quite belongs to his environment. Douglas was an abolitionist who came to defend the Constitution as a good promise that should be kept. Lincoln was a temperate Whig who recoiled most intemperately at the very thought of making a peaceful settlement with slavery. For these lectures, it would have been possible to pick out only orators or only imaginative writers from later periods, but the difference of vocation among Douglas, Du Bois, and Ellison is part of the interest of a certain convergence in their observations and arguments. Douglas speaks as a political dissident in the cause of emancipation. If one writes his message large, one may call it the cause of radical democracy. Du Bois was by gift and temperament, as I said, a scholar, encyclopedic in his curiosity and his range. Ellison has been mainly judged and would have wished to be judged as an artist, one who aspired to create continuously in the most prestigious genre of imaginative writing of his time, the novel. But all of them, freely as they crossed the genres of history, criticism, and personal narrative, may have been most at home in the essay. For Douglas, say, the spoken polemical essay, At home there, perhaps because it's a form that permits analytic rigor to cohabit with inventive freedom. As I hope will emerge, they have this too in common, that they are non-catastrophic thinkers about oppression and the remedy of oppression, and the difficulty of honest self-assertion for an individual who is a member of an oppressed minority. With the partial exception of Du Bois, they avoid the mystique of race. Their ethics seems to be centered on personal rights and not folk identity. To say it differently, they're able, from their experience, to speak for the political value of nonconformity against a majority they can see is always prepared to excuse itself. There's some sense in which all three writers propound a doctrine of solidarity, but if one asks solidarity with what, the answers are discrete and not simply deducible from the broad ground of the protest. Douglas looked to the abolition of slavery as a catalyst of full citizenship for blacks, and was militant against every retrogression that prevented that full participation in American society, which he thought must be the sequel. Du Bois, in the first half of his long career, pursued a vision of racial equality that should be led by a gifted and generous minority within the minority. Later, he turned to an organized and, if necessary, a segregated movement for economic independence, and finally to an international party of economic equality. Ellison looked for the expansion of the miscellaneous and unpredictable experience that's possible in the American city. These ideals are elusive and subject to modifications, some of them eccentric, many dictated by acute disappointment. But one finds remarkable agreement in one area. None of these writers embraced the American dream. None of them is a success monger. They're concerned with individual dignity as the good to be preserved above all in circumstances of oppression. In Supplies, I'll try to do all three with interlocutors who are white, hence the subtitle of this series. I hope in a small way to answer the demand Nathan Huggins made some 3 decades ago for an integrated political, social, and moral history of the United States. It, the history, cannot be told, Huggins wrote in 1986, as a story of black and white history. It must be told as one. And now I give a small warning to people who've never heard me before. About 40% of what follows will be quotation. Much better than anything you could hear from me in any case. The voice of honest indignation is the voice of God. Those words about prophecy by William Blake could have been describing Frederick Douglass. We commonly divide the human faculties into reflection and passion, but in considering the persuasive powers of Douglass, it may be truer to speak of reflective passion, a passion that is muscular and reiterated but never out of control, and that seeks an immediate response in the experience of the listener. Douglass addresses what is owing to a person as a simple matter of humanity, and he teaches the efficacy of justified anger and reproach at having that dignity withheld. But withheld is too passive a characterization. It's a deprivation, a cheat, a swindle. The sort of language that made William Lloyd Garrison say that the Constitution, because it compromised with slavery, was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. This length of bitter reproach we don't quite find in Frederick Douglass, but he comes close. If metaphysical condemnation like that makes no part of his earnestness, still Douglass's continuous rhetorical power derives from the conveyed impression of, you don't want this. My apologies for the mess that I would be glad to help clean up later. Let me start that sentence again. If metaphysical condemnation makes no part of Douglass's earnestness, still, his continuous rhetorical power derives from the conveyed impression of anger that is marshaled into arguments. The argument is all important. It signifies that he is taking his opponent at his word, showing his inadequacy on terms already conceded and well understood. The orations of Frederick Douglass from the early 1850s through the Civil War and its aftermath sometimes anticipate phrases and formulations, and sometimes echo and always seem to accompany Lincoln's thought. There are strong affinities of genius between the two men and between their patterns of argument on slavery. I'll be looking closely at just two speeches by Douglass that are among his most familiar. Maybe something fresh about them will emerge from investigation in this context. The meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro was delivered in 1852 in his hometown of Rochester. And Douglass, near the start of it, adopts a language almost biblical, but quite plain. 70 years and 10, he tells his audience, is the allotted time for individual men, but nations number their years by thousands. According to this fact, you are, even now, you Americans, he means, only the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. He goes on to distinguish what it means to celebrate in the present year, 1852, the glories of our ancient resistance to tyranny, and what it meant to stand with the weak against the strong in 1776. Courage like that is a merit which seems unfashionable in our day. The cause of liberty may be stabbed by the men who glory in the deeds of your fathers. And Douglass goes on to admonish all Americans who take the honor of the occasion as a thing merely ceremonial. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests. They were peace men, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission and bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. The fall from courage to complacency was a standard topic in Douglass's generation, but a Jeremiad on the decline of patriotic morale isn't his aim here. He's concerned rather with the hesitation and diffidence, and if possible, the denial of stark truths with which Americans now look at the crisis on their doorstep, 1852. As a people, Americans, he says, are remarkably familiar with all facts which make in their own favor. Wonderful. And how we still are. And the pertinent experience at present is what celebrants of the joyous holiday are most apt to ignore. They ignore slavery, says Douglass, because they can. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so obdurate and dead to the claims of gratitude that would not thankfully acknowledge such priceless benefits? But such is not the case. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. And pause a moment at the word gratitude, the feeling and gesture that follow from a lucky enhancement of life, where we know the luck was no accident, that it had a willing source. The word gratitude can seem to pass by lightly here, but it's given special stress by Douglass, which will come back in another connection. Now, in a sweeping phrase that Lincoln will be heard to speak for the first time 13 years later in the second inaugural, my subject, says Douglass, fellow citizens, is American slavery. And quoting Garrison's already famous advertisement from the first Liberator, he continues, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me, that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. The deception of that double standard and the religious hypocrisy that is both a cause and consequence of the deception. These things, says Douglas, are open to inspection by anyone who surveys the work done by white and black men alike. While we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. Oddly, I think anticipating something Lincoln wrote in private in one of his notebooks, if I remember right, where he says, if slavery is a good, as our Southern brethren claim, it is the only good that a man does not want for himself. Even as Douglas speaks, the moral crime of the slave trade and the slave markets, he knows, is being perpetuated. I was born amid such sights and scenes. To me, the American slave trade is a terrible reality. When a child, my soul was often pierced with a sense of its horrors. I lived on Philpott Street, Fells Point, Baltimore, and have watched from the wharves the slave ships in the basin, anchored from the shore, with their cargoes of human flesh waiting for favorable winds to waft them down the Chesapeake. There was at that time a grand slave mart kept at the head of Pratt Street by Austin Waltfolk. His agents were sent into every town and county in Maryland, announcing their arrival through the papers and on flaming handbills headed "Cash for Negroes." These men were generally well-dressed men and very captivating in their manners, ever ready to drink, to treat, and to gamble. The fate of many a slave has depended upon the turn of a single card. At this point, it is addressed Douglas, like Lincoln, but 5 years sooner, singles out as a particular offense of American justice the incorporation of the fugitive slave law in the Compromise of 1850. By an act of the American Congress not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. By that act, Mason and Dixon's line has been obliterated. New York has become as Virginia, and the power to hold, hunt, and sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but is now an institution of the whole United States. The power is coextensive with the Star-Spangled Banner and American Christianity. Where these go may go also the merciless slave hunter. The fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery and 5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any 2 villains is sufficient under the hell-black enactment to send the most pious and exemplary black man into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony is nothing. He can bring no witnesses for himself. True at Guantanamo, too, by the way. Lincoln, by contrast, in his first great political address, the speech on the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, gave a remarkably neutral characterization of the Compromise of 1850. And indeed, it's also a great passage describing the Compromise of 1850 in that speech by Lincoln. And it's about as clear as history gets. 4 paragraphs, and you know everything you need to know about it. But to praise it is not my point here. Indeed, at its tactical climax, Lincoln inserted a piece of trimming advice in that speech on the most disgraceful element of the Compromise. Stand with the abolitionist in restoring the Missouri Compromise, and stand against him when he attempts to repeal the fugitive slave law. In the latter case, you stand with the Southern disunionist. What of that? You are still right. In both cases, you are right. In both cases, you oppose the dangerous extremes. At this early moment, then, with Douglas in 1852 and Lincoln in 1854, we seem to see an irresolvable antagonism on a point of principle. At the very moment, says Douglas, again, that they are thanking God for the enjoyment of civil and religious liberty and for the right to worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences, they are utterly silent in respect to a law which robs religion of its chief significance and makes it utterly worthless to a world lying in wickedness. Did this law concern the mint, anise, and cumin, abridge the right to sing psalms, to partake of the sacrament, or to engage in any of the ceremonies of religion, it would be smitten by the thunder of 1,000 pulpits. Now, as it happens, Lincoln, in the same Kansas-Nebraska speech I quoted, actually fell in with Douglas's train of thought here and offered an analogy strikingly similar on the difference between the status of the slave as a person and a commodity such as mint, anise, or cumin. Here, this is Lincoln now, or at Washington, and he's speaking in Peoria, here or at Washington, I would not trouble myself with the oyster laws of Virginia or the cranberry laws of Indiana. And if, Lincoln goes on, if the Negro is not a man, why in that case he who is a man may, as a matter of self-government, do just as he pleases with him. But if a Negro is a man, is it not to that extent a total destruction of self-government to say that he too shall not govern himself? When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government, that is despotism. Douglas devotes a large part of his 4th of July speech to a denunciation of the American church, and his references to God in general are, to my ear, more frequent and more convincing than Lincoln's. Nevertheless, his 4th of July speech advances the same historical view of the Constitution that one finds Lincoln deploy first in the Kansas-Nebraska and 5.5 years later in the Cooper Union speech, which adds new evidence to support the arguments. While I do not, says Douglas, intend to argue this question on the present occasion, let me ask, if it be not somewhat singular that the Constitution were intended to be by its framers and adopters a slaveholding instrument, why neither, if that was the case, why neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave can anywhere be found in it? What would, and as many, perhaps most of you know, Lincoln supposed, and he brought this out very sharply in the Cooper Union address in early 1860, that the reason the word slave was not included in the document was that though they had to compromise with the institution, they found it an excrescence, a wen, a canker on their ideal project, and they didn't want to use the word. They were shamed by the word. I take it this is Douglas's train of thought. 2, what would be thought of an instrument legally drawn up for the purpose of entitling the city of Rochester to a tract of land in which no mention of land was made? Douglas concludes with a paean on the inevitability of progress and the near certainty that slavery must be destroyed sooner or later by the development of industry and commerce and the consequences of such advance for laboring men. To us, there is bound to be something a little strange, almost incongruous, in this turn to the optative mood by Douglas. But the faith in progress of the 19th century had an overwhelming consistency. It was a sign of an advanced mind, and thinkers as diverse as Emerson, Marx, Comte, Huxley, and John Stuart Mill all shared the belief in progress as if it were faith in a fact. And so did I in my childhood. I think people who are children now are the first real American generation that perhaps doesn't have that faith. So it's more than plausible for Douglas to appeal from slavery to the iron laws of social development. He means this also as a goad to patriotic pride. America once stood in the vanguard. Will she now fall to the rear? Quote, nations do not now stand in the same relation to each other that they did ages ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot round in the same old path of its fathers without interference. Boy, his prose is a lot like Lincoln's there too, and in other places. Usually Douglas is a bit higher. He has more 18th century models, Burke being one, I suppose. Anyway, the time was when such could be done, but a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. Lincoln, for his part, struck a similar note in his 1858 speech on discoveries and inventions, delivered at the Milwaukee Agricultural Fair. But his own endorsement of progress registered a doubt whether the empires could be trusted to fall eventually just because of their backwardness. A significant part of his lecture would attack the imperialist enthusiasm of Young America, that movement whose spokesman was Stephen Douglas and whose watchwords were continental expansion and manifest destiny. It's a very strange performance, that speech, that apparently optimistic speech by Lincoln. I'm sure assumed to be optimistic by most of the farmers who heard it. But Lincoln was anti-slavery even then, and he says somewhere in the speech, the sentence goes a lot like this. The Negro, or the modern method of using him, was also an invention. It's a sentence I have stared at until it stared back at me. I have no idea what was in his mind when he said that. But for an anti-slavery politician to say that means that discoveries and inventions are not only for the good. It's interesting that in this regard, Douglas is more the optimist of the two. The resemblances I've indicated between earlier utterances then by Douglas and Lincoln have their source in a curious resemblance between the personalities of the two men and the conditions in which they became Americans. Douglas would later say that Lincoln was the first great man he had met in the country. I think he says it's the only great man he met in the country, who spoke to him as an equal without evident consciousness of race. And he believed their closeness stemmed from their humble origins. Though humble is really too weak a word. Both men came to occupy stations of the highest eminence from beginnings that would seem to have ruled out such a possibility. Beyond the obvious facts I've mentioned, John Stauffer and David Blight have pointed out the impressive resonances between these two careers overall. And I hope those biographers would agree, nothing more vividly supports the identity of civic vocation shared by Douglas and Lincoln than the astonishing impartiality of the eulogy on Lincoln that Douglas delivered 11 years after his death. Douglas, I suspect, took conscious care in waiting for a proper occasion, and he found it in 1876 at the unveiling of the Freedmen's Monument in Washington, D.C. His speech is remarkable alike for its passion, its historical sweep, and the almost pedagogic tenderness with which it imparts a difficult lesson to an audience prepared to receive it. Douglas, who had criticized Lincoln's hesitations during the Civil War, so far from pulling back, now repeats his criticisms in order to see Lincoln fairly, even after his death. There's Nathan Huggins in his notes to the Library of America, Du Bois, prints the comment in, I believe, a Cambridge or Boston newspaper on his valedictorian address, for which he chose as a subject Jefferson Davis. And I'll talk about that a little tomorrow. Strange and wonderful speech, and the writing in it is of extraordinary quality. But the paper described Du Bois' attitude toward Jefferson Davis as being almost contemptuous in its fairness. I don't know how to turn that phrase to capture what Douglas here is doing with Lincoln, because there's no contempt in it. But the way up to the praise is a steep hike. And this is the wonderful thing about that eulogy. He opens with an explanation of the meaning of this commemoration. I warmly congratulate you, and the you in the audience here is mainly the black people in the audience, though as you'll see, it's not everyone who was there. There were many others too. Upon the highly interesting object which has caused you to assemble in such numbers and spirit as you have today. Wise and thoughtful men of our race who shall come after us and study the lesson of our history in the United States, who shall survey the long and dreary spaces over which we have traveled, who shall count the links in the great chain of events by which we have reached our present position, will make a note of this occasion. They will think of it and speak of it with a sense of manly pride and complacency. Manly is a word we've lost, and a word that will come back in a crucial context in Du Bois, the vices of servility, lewdness, and apathy. He contrasts with the virtues of manliness, chastity, and aspiration. Douglas here is speaking for all the aspirations of the emancipated. We're here to express as best we may by appropriate forms and ceremonies our grateful sense of the vast, high, and preeminent services rendered to ourselves, to our race, to our country, and to the whole world by Abraham Lincoln. The sentiment that brings us here today is one of the noblest that can stir and thrill the human heart. It is the sentiment of gratitude and appreciation. For the first time in the history of our people and in the history of the whole American people, we join in this high worship and march conspicuously in the line of this time-honored custom. First things are always interesting, and this is one of our first things. Let those who despise us, not less than those who respect us, know that now and here, in the spirit of liberty, loyalty, and gratitude, we, the colored people, newly emancipated and rejoicing in our blood-bought freedom near the close of the first century in the life of this republic, have now and here unveiled, set apart, and dedicated a monument of enduring granite and bronze, in every line, feature, and figure of which the men of this generation may read, and those of after-coming generations may read, something of the exalted character and great works of Abraham Lincoln, the first martyr president of the United States. Why, it might be asked, does he speak of gratitude as an indication of virtue? Many in the revolutionary generation of the 1790s and early 1800s, whose works he, like Lincoln, would have read, Tom Paine among them, would have identified gratitude as a vice and have associated it with calculated flattery of one's social betters. Douglas must mean gratitude not in the sense of a favor returned. That would merely be good business practice translated into the decencies of moral conduct. But rather the unforced and unasked recognition of a good deed done for its own sake, to which, as beneficiary, one feels compelled to make some response. In this instance, the collective response that Douglas will lead his audience in performing. But once again, a compunction prevents him from confusing present with past feelings. Here's Douglas again. It must be admitted, truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interest, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. And with a memory that refuses to yield, Douglas now hardens his reservation further. And this is perhaps the best known passage of the great eulogy. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. In all his education and feeling, he was an American of the Americans. He came into the presidential chair upon one principle alone, namely opposition to the extension of slavery. To protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery in the states where it existed, Abraham Lincoln was not less ready than any other president to draw the sword of the nation. He was ready to execute all the supposed guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system anywhere inside the slave states. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master and to suppress a slave rising for liberty. He means John Brown, for whom Douglas was a hero. Who for Douglas was a hero, though his guilty master were already in arms against the government. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, out there in the audience too, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by force of circumstance, and necessity, necessity being a favorite word of Lincoln's, which he defined with extraordinary interest in a number of ways on a number of occasions. Now, when the audience of freedmen and women hear Frederick Douglass say that Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, it's difficult to imagine this would not somehow lower their estimate of Lincoln. And yet, Douglass's larger purpose is to incite reflection on the nature of the country in which this status of white man's president would necessarily be true of whatever man ascended to the presidency from whatever party. But let's not understand him too quickly. Douglas was evidently of two minds, or of different minds at different times, when he thought about Lincoln as a representative of his race and presider over the interests of white men. Lincoln meant something more to Douglas, something harder to capture, when in a speech that David Blight dates at roughly June 1865, he said, quote, and this is Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, while surpassed in his devotion to the welfare of the white race, wasn't unsurpassed. While unsurpassed in his devotion to the welfare of the white race, was in a sense, hitherto without example, the black man's president, the first to show any respect to their rights as men. In fact, I believe that Douglas's thought then in 1865, just a few weeks after the assassination of the president, is compatible with his formulation 11 years further on. For Lincoln was unique in a way hitherto incomparable, unique by virtue of his commitment to advance the interests of black men. Fellow citizens, Douglas continues in 1876, ours is no newborn zeal and devotion, merely a thing of this moment. The name of Abraham Lincoln was near and dear to our hearts in the darkest and most perilous hours of the Republic. Our faith in him was often taxed and strained to the utmost, but it never failed. When he tarried long in the mountain, when strangely he told us that we were the cause of the war, that's in the visit of the delegation of black men in August 1862. It's a passing remark by Lincoln, saying, you should not want to live here, people don't seem to want you. It's his one overt finger in the scale for colonization when he seems at that one moment. And yet Lincoln, when he speaks to this delegation of black men in the White House, telling them these discouraging things, has almost certainly already decided to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So weigh that how you will. When he refused to employ our arms in defense of the Union, Douglas wanted him to have black soldiers early, Lincoln delayed. When after accepting our services as colored soldiers, he refused to retaliate our murder and torture as colored prisoners. He gave the order that men who recaptured them should be executed, but none ever were. When he told us he would save the Union if he could with slavery. When he revoked the proclamation of emancipation of General Fremont. When he refused to remove this is quite a bill of grievances, still live 11 years later. When he refused to remove the popular commander of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan, in the days of its inaction and defeat, who was more zealous in his efforts to protect slavery than to suppress rebellion. When we saw all this and more, we were at times grieved, stunned, and greatly bewildered. But our hearts believed while they ached and bled. Nor was this, even at that time, a blind and unreasoning superstition. Despite the mist and haze that surrounded him, despite the tumult, the hurry, and confusion of the hour, we were able to take a comprehensive view of Abraham Lincoln and to make reasonable allowance for the circumstances of his position. We saw him, measured him, and estimated him. They could judge him as the white people whose president he was could not. Not by stray utterances to injudicious and tedious delegations who often tried his patience, not by isolated facts torn from their connection, not by any partial and imperfect glimpses caught at inopportune moments, but by a broad survey in the light of the stern logic of great events, and in view of that divinity which shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will, we came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had somehow met in the person of Abraham Lincoln. It mattered little to us what language he might employ on special occasions. It mattered little to us when we fully knew him, whether he was swift or slow in his movements. It was enough for us that Abraham Lincoln was at the head of a great movement and was in living and earnest sympathy with that movement, which in the nature of things must go on until slavery should be utterly and forever abolished in the United States. Here Douglas imparts a summary of the obstructions that Lincoln met with and in some cases created by his own fears, doubts, and excess of prudence. But what's most striking to a reader now is what this passage refrains from saying. For the unconditional abolitionist Douglas, who knew and at the time deplored Lincoln's tardiness on emancipation, here goes over the ground of some of his largest public disagreements with the president. He, Douglas, had sided with General Fremont against the revocation of the early Emancipation Order. And he almost backed Fremont as a presidential candidate against Lincoln in the election of 1864 before Douglas spoke the immortal words, the words, "The Republican Party is the ark, all else is the sea." Yet Lincoln is understood as a creature, partly of the circumstance that history gave him to act in. This realization doesn't incline the speaker to admire him less. For circumstances, too, made Lincoln the actual leader of a movement larger than himself. Douglas again. Under his rule and in the fullness of time, we saw Abraham Lincoln. He's really taking him over as the black man's president after all, isn't he? We saw him. We knew him. We knew him best. You barely knew him. It's amazing of a persuasive speech that's really moving in two directions at once. Maybe half knows it. In the fullness of time, we saw Abraham Lincoln, after giving the slaveholders 3 months' grace in which to save their hateful slave system, penning the immortal paper, which, though special in its language, because it made exceptions for the border states and so on, was general in its principles and effect, making slavery forever impossible in the United States. Though we waited long, we saw all this and more. Can any colored man or any white man friendly to the freedom of all men ever forget the night which followed the first day of January 1863, when the world was to see if Abraham Lincoln would prove to be as good as his word? I shall never forget that memorable night when in a distant city I waited and watched at a public meeting with 3,000 others not less anxious than myself for the word of deliverance which we have heard read today. Nor shall I ever forget the outburst of joy and thanksgiving that rent the air when the lightning brought to us the Emancipation Proclamation. In that happy hour, we forgot all delay and forgot all tardiness, forgot that the president had bribed the rebels to lay down their arms by a promise to withhold the bolt which would smite the slave system with destruction, and we were thenceforward willing to allow the president all the latitude of time, phraseology, and every honorable device that statesmanship might require for the achievement of a great and beneficent measure of liberty and progress. Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, more than any order he issued as commander-in-chief or any words he spoke, is here made the ultimate indication of his stature. Douglas takes the unusual step for a speaker on a non-religious occasion of descending to join his audience in an attitude not of assent or enthusiasm, but humility. He was one of the grateful when he heard the news of January 1, 1863. This recollection of an earlier celebration, the first, it might be said, that made black people true participants in the meaning of the 4th of July, it's this mood that opens onto the most grave and uninflated and generous estimate that perhaps ever was delivered by one statesman concerning another. Douglas speaks as one who has acquaintance with the flaws of the great. He has recited them in Lincoln's case without extenuation. But now he steps back and turns the subject over in his mind and almost audibly asks his audience to pause. There follows a resumption of balance that's in no way equivocal. That is, it takes back none of the preceding criticism regarding Lincoln now in his chosen and necessary role, so different in essence from Douglas's own. It finds a heroic proportion between the lights and shadows of his presidency. This summing up of Douglas. I've said that President Lincoln was a white man and shared the prejudices common to his countrymen towards the colored race. His great mission was to accomplish two things. First, to save his country from dismemberment and ruin, and second, to free his country from the great crime of slavery. To do one or the other, or both, he must have the earnest sympathy and powerful cooperation of his loyal fellow countrymen. Without this primary and essential condition to success, his efforts must have been vain and utterly fruitless. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, as Douglas wanted him to, pleaded with him to do, rebuked him for not doing, had he done that, his efforts must have been vain and utterly fruitless. Had he put, he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of the American people and rendered resistance to rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. but measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult. He was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Lincoln, as the speaker sums up his presidency, was assailed on all sides by the slaveholders of the South for having all along plotted the extinction of their way of life, by the abolitionists in Congress for his slowness in marking the right time for the radical deed, and by Whigs at heart like Horace Greeley, now for his immobility, now for his rashness. But we, says Douglas, we who have known the meaning of emancipation are of all others best situated to judge him now. Now behold the change, he says. The judgment of the present hour is, taking him all in all, measuring the tremendous magnitude of the work before him, considering the necessary means to ends, and surveying the end from the beginning. Infinite wisdom has seldom sent any man into the world better fitted for his mission than Abraham Lincoln. It's the age of world historical heroes, too. And Douglas has, against all the odds in his own mind, just fashioned Lincoln into one. Karl Marx had this same high opinion of Lincoln. Lincoln's honesty is reckoned by Douglas a part of his courage, maybe a necessary condition for it. And here he's able to see a truth of character owing to an affinity with himself. Quote, his moral training was against his saying one thing when he meant another. The trust that Abraham Lincoln had in himself and in the people was surprising and grand, but it was also enlightened and well-founded. He knew the American people better than they knew themselves. Well, that's a compliment to the American people, of a sort dangerous to deliver to a corporate body, and the American people then or now, or for that matter, any people at any time, may hardly seem to deserve it. But Douglas has justified the height of the praise by his words and the actions of his life that support the words. It makes, I think, a gesture of magnanimity and reconciliation comparable to Lincoln's in the second inaugural. He finishes on the note of gratitude, a sentiment endowed with a fresh significance after his intervening meditation. In doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator, we have been doing highest honors to ourselves and those who come after us. So there's nothing shuffling, nothing low or flattering in this sense of gratitude. We've been fastening ourselves to a name and fame imperishable and immortal. When now it shall be said that the colored man is soulless, that he has no appreciation of benefits or benefactors, when the foul reproach of ingratitude is hurled at us and it is attempted to scourge us beyond the range of human brotherhood, we may calmly point to the monument. Of course, his monument in words is greater than the physical one. But we have this day erected to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to point out what a tremendous work this speech expects to see performed by the homage given to one man. But Douglas was also engaged in a performance of a larger kind. 24 years earlier, we recall, he had spoken in a very different tenor in a speech of honest ingratitude. Fellow citizens, he said to his listeners in 1852, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? The consequences of the original American independence for the Negro were many further generations of involuntary servitude, the last extremity of enforced dependence. And in that 4th of July speech, as we've seen, Douglas had called the criminal institution American slavery, a slavery that was a national condition, accepted even if not approved by the entire nation. If honest indignation is Douglas's leading quality as a speaker and writer, his eulogy on Lincoln is an exceptional performance, a work not of protest but of instruction in the feelings that serve to perpetuate peace. And the first among such feelings is gratitude. Douglas was clearly struck by the trace of servility, as I've said, that may confuse or misdirect the ties of earnest sympathy across the color line between benefactor and beneficiary. The trouble is perhaps not resolved, but may be clarified if we think of gratitude as a form of prayer to something beyond either of the parties of the interaction. A prayer, say, to the spirit of nature, such as we find at the end of Coleridge's poem Frost at Midnight, which speaks of a thankfulness that transcends any merely reciprocal relation, as if the gift that was received has come from something not in anyone's grasp. Speaking of nature itself, there as a teacher, much as Jesus was teacher to his disciples, Coleridge addresses his sleeping child with regard to that teaching. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. So the giving is by God or nature or life, by history, if it helps you to say it that way. Anyway, the most generous gift in a life of freedom comes from an intuition of blessings in our existence that we cannot explain or account for, so that we're left with a sense of glory we can't connect with any finite and willing agent. The overflow of this feeling of blessedness manifests itself in prayer, an asking that can only come from us. In some way hard to analyze, Douglas supposed, freedom should make us ask for duties to perform. It's important that he's saying this to his black audience in the presence of an audience, some of whom are white, and important that some of his listeners have lived out the transition that directly warrants such gratitude, while others, their children, were born free, or in the great words of the Emancipation Proclamation, then, thenceforward, and forever free. The expression of their gratitude to the name of a person who cannot be there to receive it will be one of their first things, a gift freely given. Let me close by confessing a scruple I've had in concentrating quite as I have done on Douglas and Lincoln together. Douglas was an unconditional abolitionist who said again and again that slavery was a crime against humanity, that it was not enough to put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction, but it must, like other criminal acts in progress, be stopped immediately, that this was a cause Americans should want to die for, and that the Civil War was, if it was not to trail off in an anticlimax both feeble and grotesque, a war directed to abolition. And Douglas consistently acted in keeping with the words he spoke. His words were a form of action. Every time he mounted a rostrum, he was risking his life. Lincoln, though he hated slavery and thought it should be ended, and said so early and persistently, for most of a decade kept an equivocal stance on when and how exactly it should be extinguished. The equivocation narrowed into an almost unmistakable and single-minded commitment beginning in September 1862, and by mid-1864, when he began pushing hard for the passage of a 13th Amendment to make slavery illegal throughout the United States, Lincoln has become a thoroughgoing abolitionist. Some of the difference between Douglas's moral principle and Lincoln's temporizing and gradual adoption of that principle must be ascribed, just as Douglas tells us it must, to the position of answerable power that Lincoln held as president, a situation whose complexities have never received a more concise and accurate characterization than the one Douglas gave. But there's a complex truth implicit in this relationship that carries broad implications for political morality generally. Douglas needed Lincoln to advance his cause, and Lincoln needed Douglas to advance his, and only by tacit collaboration could their aims finally be proved identical. Both men knew this. Lincoln died with that knowledge, and Douglas's interest in carrying it forward to future generations partly accounts for the passion stirring in every phrase and sentence of this oration of 1876. After he's walked all around his subject, we know that his words are as unforced as they are unexaggerating. A simple sentiment has found an outlet in language miraculously adequate to the occasion. Douglas, by this speech, was giving his audience a foundation in first things that would fortify them against later possible discouragements, but he was also making himself, I think, less lonely, and maybe he was reminding himself of a distant and imperfect but genuine companionship he had known after all. When in the early 1890s he was confronted by a decade-long epidemic of lynching, a revival in effect of the death prerogative of the slave master, which had been so unwillingly surrendered in 1865, Douglass would find the strength to launch his protest in an address, Why is the Negro Lynched, of 1894, that surpasses even his orations on the 4th of July and the Freedmen's Monument. Possibly the memory of Lincoln contributed to that strength, a happy thought, anyway, and the evidence allows it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The microphone.
Is there a napkin I can use to?
Sorry about that. Thank you, David. And you don't have to clean up, David.
Sure.
We can handle that. Questions, comments? Please. John.
Thank you for that magnificent talk. I enjoyed it very much. I love the connections that you make between Douglass and Lincoln, both as writers and in what you refer to Douglass's, both men's understanding of gratitude. You probably know that, or may know that Douglass read Lincoln's House Divided speech, quoted the first paragraph, House Divided cannot stand, it must become a...
There echoes both directions, I think.
And so in his newspaper, Douglass says, well and wisely said, and essentially then the next line is something like, I wish I would have written that myself.
And he did write it eventually.
Yes, he did write it
It's the
eventually.
title of one of his later.
So my question relates to your wonderful reading of the 1876 commemoration of the Freedmen's Monument, also the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. And one is that it's a moment in which Confederates have become resurgent. It's known as the end of Reconstruction. Lynching has become a everyday occurrence, a fact of life in the South. As Du Bois says, it's the moment in which the slave goes from standing a brief moment in the sun, meaning achieving the freedom and equality from the Reconstruction Amendments and retreating back into slavery. And Douglass says nothing about this. And he also really says nothing about Lincoln's almost lifelong endorsement of colonization until after, beginning in 1863.
I'll qualify that briefly when you finish. Go ahead.
Yeah. Or, beginning with the final Emancipation Proclamation, that's the first time in which, from that point forward, he never publicly endorses colonization. But and so colonization had been a part of a lot of anti-slavery people's views. And I mentioned that in preliminary.
Still there. Less than about a month after he meets with those black men, which didn't include Douglass.
Yeah.
In Washington, colonization is still part of the preliminary.
Right. It's also the end in his message to Congress in December of 1862. He embraces colonization, And Douglass, as you know, Douglass recognized racism as an engine undergirding slavery, and in parts of what to the slave is the 4th of July speech, and throughout the 1850s and into the Civil War, recognizes the degree to which racism constitutes a bolt on which slavery can persist and grow. So how would you address that dilemma?
That question. I won't say turn it into a question. I get it. The first part is the most interesting, and I was going to ask you, not why he suppresses mention of lynchings. He writes about that, of course, much later, as I mentioned, but there's nothing Douglass ever hesitates to say if it's really in his mind. This is a speech for this occasion. But I wondered if awareness of that renewed hostility and the breakdown of Reconstruction wasn't behind what he says when he says, so when they accuse us of not being part of the human brotherhood, when we are scourged by that terrible slander, let us show there's this statue. I think that's the polemical motive for that otherwise, peculiar, a little bit unmotivated sounding detail of the speech. He's feeling a new justified indignation about not only these actions against black people, but the re-legitimation of old cliches about they don't quite have sentiments the way we do. About colonization, we may disagree. I mean, I've read your book, and I know many other scholars, including Eric Foner in his recent book, whom I admire, take much more seriously Lincoln's interest in colonization than I can do based on what I see reading Lincoln and reading the histories. I would not say he embraced colonization. He showed a lukewarm pro forma interest in it that only finally died down, somewhere in 1863, I would say that. He was about as keen on immigration as, say, and I don't mean to be contemporary and turn all this into current events, but he was about as keen on immigration as President Obama was keen on keeping going deep sea oil drilling, okay? You have to do it if you're president. There's no enthusiasm for it, and the important statement on that, I think, that's what makes his cold remark to the delegation of black people so peculiar. It's not just cold, it's apathetic. And Lincoln does sometimes tune so low, there's almost no vibration. It's like he's a man from Mars. There is that feeling of his impartiality sounds very different from Douglas's. And he hits one of those moments in that speech, in that published account of his dialogue with the delegation. But I take it that the crucial statement by Lincoln on colonization is in the long paragraph of the Kansas-Nebraska speech, September, October 1854, when he says, slavery it's a monstrous injustice. I hate it as I hate all injustice, and also for what it does to our Republican fame throughout the world. And then he says, but what are we to do? If somebody were to ask me, I would say, free them all, but what then? And then one by one, he goes through the possible consequences of freeing them all. Do we make them full citizens? Lincoln says, I can't imagine that. Do we have some limbo caste status where they're not slaves but not citizens? What does that mean? And then he says, he undertakes to consider colonization. He says, you can't do it, it's impractical. It's impractical on the mass level where it would have to occur. So he throws up his hands. And that speech was one he gave in different versions and variations many times. It has equivocations in it, and I cited one. It's a speech by a politician who is emerging back into an almost national concern with politics, about to become one of the founders of the Republican Party. But I think he worked on that as hard as he worked on anything, and that's his attitude toward colonization. People are going to talk about it. We can't get it off our minds, but it's never going to work out finally. And there was one last thing in your question I wanted to address, but I've forgotten it. Maybe somebody else will. Okay.
Questions, comments?
Hi, David. I want to ask you about gratitude. And because that word, the only place where I really can remember reading gratitude treated as a kind of political or quasi-legal category is in Grotius, the father of international law, who really seems to take gratitude and ingratitude as seriously as King Lear does, and much more rationally. But I'm just wondering about your analysis of gratitude, and whether gratitude is, and it's not as though I have any clue about what the answer to this is. If we see the pivot from a world of supplication to a world of rights, which is what happens in this period you're talking about. And here I just want to briefly reference this amazing book by Leah Whittington on supplication in the classical period up through Milton, that talks about it as a pre-human rights era, where if you want something, your only position is to beg for it or ask for it, and that is completely eliminated once you have rights. And the voting rights did follow immediately from the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a call to arms in part, and the 15th Amendment.
So once you have rights, why gratitude? And Douglas is doing something really morally radical and ancient by invoking it that way. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I just want.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, well, you go ahead.
Well, if I catch Elaine Scarry's drift, she denied that he had any thought on the subject. But it sounds as if on that history of gratitude as a virtue, which is driven out by the regime of rights starting to come in the late 18th century, and pretty well already the language we now take for granted about human liberty and equality by the end of the Civil War, Douglass would have recognized that people who have rights think it's a rather low, retrogressive, unprideful thing to want to show gratitude when, after all, I got rights, man. I mean, why do I have to say thank you to anybody? The politics gives me the rights. And it's interesting. It's a very rich subject. I've been guided into it, I guess, by reading Coleridge, by reading other romantics, and seeing what an argument there is about it in that period, around 1800. Godwin treats it as a vice in political justice. His partial disciple, Shelley, treats it as a vice. Wordsworth treats it as a vice in the Convention of Sintra, 1806, 07, 08. And that's late for Wordsworth. He's not any longer a political radical, but he still sees there's something of self-respect that militates against showing gratitude. Burke, who's the most interesting writer on this subject outside Shakespeare, and who's reading King Lear to think about gratitude, I think, says in A Letter to a Noble Lord, 1796, ingratitude is the first of revolutionary virtues. And he's saying that ironically. That is to say, these people are no longer human. Gratitude is no longer natural to them. And I find the tension there that you're speaking of, and I got to get the name of that book again from you, but I find the tension still there, far as we are into the regime now no longer of nation-based, but of international human rights. So for instance, you can, if you say about someone, and this may come from parental experience, some of it bitter, undoubtedly, though I hope with no excess. If you can say of someone, he is incapable of gratitude, you're still saying something harsh, and you're understood to be saying something pretty corrosive about the person. But if you're to say about somebody, oh, he's really good at gratitude, he shows it all the time, it's not good either. So, I mean, there's something about us in the way we regard that show or that demonstration that is, it goes many different directions. But I think Douglass is doing something, can be seen to be doing something simple, and I wanted to translate out of the simplicity into something like what you're pointing to. So,
David, what do you make of the fact that there had never been a black person ever in the history of this country to speak before such a powerful group of white people, ever? You didn't mention it. I'm not sure why, but you said there were a few white people there. I can't remember.
They're dignitaries, luminaries.
It was the cabinet and the Supreme Court and the President of the United States. There had never been a white audience for a black speaker like that ever. Not for Douglass, not for Douglass, and not for anyone. That I keep that in mind when I think about the speech, and the fact that the reason they're there is that regular black people had just chipped in pennies. They ponied up the money.
Yeah.
It's called the Freedmen's Memorial Monument, and it was the first time black people who had only been free, around 90% of the black population had only been free for 11 years by this time, right? And they ponied up the money, just pennies, like a March of Dimes campaign when I was growing up. So you had these two ironies, that this event is occasioned by just newly freed slaves who paid for it, but on the stage of the most powerful white people in government. I'm sure there were rich white people who weren't there.
And he barely mentions them.
Yeah, he barely mentions them.
And I barely mention them.
And you did, and I want to know why you didn't. The other thing, but they're just sort of footnotes, is that all the slaves were black, but not all the blacks were slaves.
Right.
And that's very important when you think about Lincoln and you think about Douglass. Remember in 1860, 90% of the 4.4 million black people, 90% were enslaved, but 488,000 were free. So there was always this sort of third term, white, black, slave free, and then this, this in-between status. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that, particularly when you think about Lincoln. I happen to be not, and I am not forgiving about colonization. I do not think that what he said in 1854 wipes out everything else he said about colonization. I think he just couldn't figure out how to do it. I don't think Lincoln was a friend of black people. I think he was a foe of slavery. And he didn't even know black people. He had a black barber, and the first black man he ever probably had a real conversation with was Fred. And how many times did they talk? 3? So I have a different take on Lincoln is definitely anti-slavery. There is no doubt about that. But his attitude toward black people, I don't think he understood what a black person was. I think that Douglass was sort of like this guy who comes from outer space and he's talking to him. Wow, it's like a black man is really smart. I don't see this relationship of equality and.
Well, it's more than that. The people in the White House lackeys wanted to turn Douglass out, and Lincoln kept him in.
Did.
And was particularly interested in what he said. I think he'd read Douglass. I think he'd read a fair amount of Douglass.
Yeah.
And it's one of the racist remarks made by Stephen Douglas in an early debate. There's Mrs. Lincoln riding around in the carriage with Fred Douglass. So, I mean, the feeling that Lincoln was akin to that in his politics in some way, it's going around there. I want to say the reason why I didn't mention the complexity of the Constitution of the audience is that I forgot when I was working on this. So it helps to be a historian very much, and thank you for that. I don't know how much it's going to enter into my sense of details of what Douglass is saying. It makes the statue more important. It makes the choice of addressing the black ex-slaves and the again complex constitution of the black audience all the more important because he's talking to them and the other people are just watching and having to be silent. As to Lincoln generally, we'll never solve that. I think I'm too far into my own understanding of Lincoln to have my mind changed on the subject. I think there was a strong current of misanthropy in Lincoln. I don't think he got very close to many people, period. It's not surprising he didn't get close to many black people. There's other testimony, which you know from Sojourner Truth, among others, who, when they met Lincoln, felt something quite different from what they felt in the presence of most white people. Look, here's Lincoln. I thought of putting it into the, this is a document, this is not a guess, from a late letter, Lincoln on race. This won't make anybody happy, but he gets a letter from a telegram, by telegraph, from a white racist. It says something like, this is after emancipation, and it goes, if 1864, white people is number one, niggers about to be cut down, and white people number one, and white people forever, and that's it. It's something like that. It's a 3/4 illiterate telegram. What president's going to reply to that? Lincoln decided to reply. And he did it through his secretary, John Nicolay. And Nicolay writes, the president has asked me to wonder whether you could supply a bit more information. Are you yourself a white man or a black man? Because if you are either, you are not situated to judge this impartially. You might, however, be so situated if you were a red man or a yellow man. Signed, President Lincoln. That doesn't advance either your cause or mine. It shows how strange Lincoln was. But it shows, I think, something about his successful indifference to certain matters of surface.
Final question, Kevin, Dr. Kevin Burke.
Thank you for the great talk. There seems something almost fated from the vantage point of 2017 that this would be the ultimate pairing, Douglass and Lincoln, that they are somehow fated to be the ultimate binary of this period to be read against one another. But there are other possibilities that existed through history, Lincoln and Davis, Lincoln and Whitman, Lincoln and Greeley. But it seems now that this is the one that...
Jefferson Davis?
Yeah,
Oh.
or Alexander Stevens, or take your pick.
Yeah, whom he
But
was interested in.
it
yeah.
seems like from this standpoint of our time that this is the ultimate pairing, that you can't really know Lincoln, or you can know Lincoln best through the lens of Douglas and perhaps vice versa, reading them against one another. And I'm wondering where that comes from, how recent that is, do you think? And do you think it ultimately rests on the recognition that slavery was the cause of the Civil War, and that until Americans could come to that, they wouldn't see that pairing as really the one that fits best?
I think that Lincoln acknowledged late, but knew all along, and the House Divided speech is where he says it and perhaps provokes the Civil War by seeing slavery as the cause. And Douglas knew it all along, too. As for the pairing, who else is so great? I mean, who else has the extraordinary quality of intellectual energy and depth that Douglas has or that Lincoln has? And they're so different from each other. It seems to me that it is a pairing rightly given. Some of my thoughts or prejudices are unseasonable, but I'm glad to think that this one is in season. You don't want Lincoln with James Russell Lowell or Douglas with William Cullen Bryant or either of them with Jefferson Davis. I just think they are extraordinarily interesting and perceptive minds informing themselves about the whole range of moral and political questions of that epoch and managing to write about it. Douglas more single-mindedly, with more, what to say, unfettered passion, and certainly with as much effect as Lincoln. But I think Lincoln finds ways of showing candor on this and other subjects that amaze us when we look closely at them. And Douglas must have been amazed too. I think that's the element of personal wonder in it. It's interesting that if you read his earlier stuff, he calls Mr. Lincoln silly and disappointing. He writes about Lincoln as if he were I.F. Stone writing about LBJ, but it's not like that. He really had felt something stronger in Lincoln, and that in this last memory and critical estimate of Lincoln, he should emphasize his truthfulness. To me, that is interesting. That the quality that was a campaign slogan for Lincoln is certified, is given weight by Douglas from his knowledge of the issues. Now, one has to add, I think, that there are, if you say these are two great thinkers and writers of the period, there's things missing in both of them. Obviously, Skip just pointed to one in Lincoln. I mean, the amount of compromise can lead to vastly divergent conclusions about where he really stood on this or that issue, not on slavery. But, there's not much literature. There's not much fancy or imagination. There's not the sense of a wide world of thought when you read Lincoln, though his reading in political thought, I think, was quite deep. I think he read everything he could get his hands on. He, too, had read Burke. He had read Rousseau with profit. It shows in those lectures on technology inventions and so on. Lincoln is ultimately, I'm afraid, he is finally a political thinker, and with all the emphasis and intensity that can imply, and with the limitations. We've had no other man of power in the history of this country who thought so deeply and originally about politics. The founders are different. They're a club, and they had the whole 18th century behind them. But Lincoln had to do it on his own and made some advances on them and saw through some of their self-deceptions. So, and as with Douglas, I mean, Douglas probably had something more time approaching school learning from other people than Lincoln did. Lincoln had less than a year education. So yeah, they're amazing in those respects, and I hope the pairing lasts for a century. So.
But your point about the pairing is fascinating, that when we were undergraduates, no one was making this pairing.
No.
That's what I was
I
thinking.
bet if you
It took
look
a long
at
time to get
yeah,
there.
if you look at Sandburg's Lincoln, I bet is Douglas in there? I doubt it. When we were undergraduate, I remember we had to, because I took Bill McFeely's Afro-Am survey course in 69, 70.
He was at Yale?
William McFeely was,
Forgot that.
he followed Gene Genovese as the professor of African American history before Blaskine was hired.
Okay.
And then he left to become dean at Amherst.
This is historiography, not just history.
He was,
Okay.
I know this because he was
Okay.
the external reader for my Scholar of the House project.
Oh, so you noticed. Okay.
So, and his son runs W.W. Norton. But the way that we read Frederick Douglass was through Philip Foner's 5-volume little yellow box set, because nobody read Frederick Douglass. And Benjamin Quarles was recuperating Douglass too. So among the people writing about Lincoln, believe me, this connection was not inevitable. So it's the work that the binary is doing which fascinates me. Take it down the next level and say, why is this quote unquote inevitable now, but it wasn't inevitable for 100 years or more? But it seems logical, blah, blah, blah. Now, because it's performing some work for us.
Well, that's part of the work you've been doing with black writing and its history, and some of what turns up is permanent. The same thing happened to Melville in the 1920s and 1930s. Yeah. Nobody read Melville as part of American literature before Mumford and Van Wyck Brooks and those others started picking them up. Now it's unimaginable without him, but I think I'm glad that it's unimaginable now without Douglass.
I tell our students, the great thing about, I think it's true for any field within the broad category of the study of literature, but a strong reading, you can bring people back from the dead. Canonization is about critical close readings, and in an emergent field, still emergent like African American literature, or this quote-unquote biracial discourse that's going on, which is very popular now in American studies between two great thinkers. You could have a big impact on the shaping of a field in the same way that my friend David Bromwich has. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for David Bromwich.